Hello, and welcome back again. What I want to talk about in this section is the ways I want to concentrate on Yugoslavia and talk about the ways in which Yugoslavia has been understood, subdominant frameworks among people looking at it from outside, particularly from the West. So I want to talk about images of Yugoslavia, and I'll be presenting to you three images that you can see as dominant in most of the Western discourse on Yugoslavia. So let's begin with the first one. First, the label I've given this is the Disneyland of the ethno-national. What this frame for understanding Yugoslavia and probably the whole region is colored by is essentialism and exoticism. That is. This is a set of ideas that regards the Balkans as a kind of periphery of Europe that includes images of primitivism. I have mentioned here two names. One of them is Maria Todorova, the historian who has, in her work Imagining the Balkans, compared the ways in which the Balkans are understood by observers from the West with Edward Said's idea of Orientalism, that is, the ways in which the Middle East has been constructed as territory undeveloped and fit for dominance. She looks at Balkanism, the variety of Orientalism that she describes as a kind of demi-Orientalism, and we can see this similarly in the work of another historian, Larry Wolff, who in his constructing Eastern Europe, constructing the Balkans, talks about travelers, especially travelers from the Enlightenment period and period after that, coming through the Balkans and describing it in a way that constitutes it as, and this is an image that will be familiar to people looking at contemporary literature about it, as Europe, but not quite Europe, this kind of fault line between Europe and Asia with an implication of differences of value and fundamental differences of culture. So this is one element of the essentialism and the exoticism that structures a dominant perception of the Balkans, and the other one is a view of nationalism. So I use this term, the Disneyland of the ethno-national, because the different populations in the Balkans are then seen as constituting some kind of essentially uniform national communities bound up in a kind of mutual hatred. But what goes beyond this is that this is a view that tends to regard nationalism as a force emerging from nature that is unavoidable. It's a kind of biologically determined category among all human groups, which is stronger than any other possible category of division. So to the degree that people are human, they are members of nations, and to the degree that they are members of nations, they are nationalists, and so conflict is viewed as inevitable. And this became very popular in the literature. I mean, especially during the time of the conflict of the 1990s, although it goes back earlier in that, an approach developed that borrows a little bit from imperialism, a little bit from Sigmund Freud's theory of the return of the repressed, a bit from this mythological view that regards nationalism as a biologically determined category. And it goes into popular literature that was extremely influential in creating an official and journalistic understanding of the Balkans, probably the best known of which was the book by the journalist Robert Kaplan, Balkan Ghosts, in which he went around. I mean, it was wonderful research. He talked to taxi drivers in different cities around the Balkans. But they say that it is the only book that when Bill Clinton was president of the United States had read about the Balkans, and it constantly repeats this phrase that has entered the discourse, centuries-old ethnic hatreds, as the basic factor that defines the Balkans and the states of former Yugoslavia. You know, it's why when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, he took a kind of defeatist attitude toward the conflict. He said there is nothing we can do to stop people in the region if they really desire so strongly to keep killing one another. And it's one that you have been able to see repeated more recently. For example, here is a quotation from the noted political theorist and literary stylist Donald Trump, who at the end of negotiations that resulted in something resembling an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo in September of 2020, said, this is a quotation from a speech at a rally. I won't read the whole quotation to you, and I won't do it imitating his voice. It's tempting. Um, but uh, but he says they have been killing each other for so many years. Now they're going to stop killing. He thinks that he has stopped them killing one another, and then says it again. He says they've been doing it for hundreds of years, frankly under different names. So you are going to have no difficulty repeating this kind of exoticizing, essentializing image endlessly in political discussion, in contemporary news coverage, in a lot of the popular literature on former Yugoslavia. The second image that I want to talk about is Yugoslavia as the graveyard of Western dreams. This is sort of a reflexive approach, but in order to understand this, we need to understand something about the position of the East in the history of the Western left, the way in which particularly people in the West who define themselves as communist or socialist, or in some cases progressive or even critical, gave a kind of exalted status to Yugoslavia, which occupied this unique intermediate position during the period of the Cold War as one of the leading states of the non-aligned movement, as a state that appeared to be searching for a sort of third way, a way of building a system that would be a socialist alternative to Soviet-style communism. This is something that was described under a lot of different terms. Self-management was one that it used for itself. Socialism with the human face was a term that was popular. That is to say that for a long period during the Cold War, people on the left in Western states and societies developed a kind of Yugoslavia fetish. There's copious evidence of this all over the place. And then their fetish betrayed them. Their fetish betrayed them in a way that showed that all of the illusions they had placed in Yugoslavia seemed to be non-productive, even counterproductive. And what happened after that was interesting. That is, the violence that was occurring in the states of the former Yugoslavia is recapitulated in extremism and intellectual factionalism among analysts of ex-Yugoslavia. This is, I think, one of the reasons why we don't concentrate on the literature on former Yugoslavia that was produced in the 1990s in a very large degree. It's because there is a generation of scholars who cross the line from scholarship into advocacy, not only into advocacy, but mutual recrimination. And it's taken really a long time since then for a new generation of scholars to try to repurify the well, to develop understandings that are based on research, and to put aside the idea that it's the role of a researcher in the region to take on the position of being the advocate for a side in a conflict, or to choose a favorite ethnicity or nationality or state. That is as much as we will say about the generation that betrayed its fetish. The third image that I want to talk about is that the former Yugoslavia becomes a kind of experimental site for the development and evaluation of new states. You know, all of the states emerging out of what was once Yugoslavia are described under the term new or young or emerging, something like that. What you see in this picture on the slide here is a monument that was put up to celebrate the declaration of independence of Kosovo in 2008 with just the word newborn. The monument has been redecorated and revised several times. I think this photo was taken as a part of a festival to celebrate the creativity of street art. But I think what's important here, I mean, all of these stations like new, young, even newborn, what this does is in the international context, it puts the states in the role not as fully adult participating members of the collective, but as children. Children who need to be educated, children who need to be overseen, children whose behavior and activity has to be administered. So what can we say about new states? I mean, I think one of the principles that we need to start from is that the main justification for this kind of treatment, for one set of states being treated as children in an international environment, is the threat of violence. So I want to talk about this threat, drawing on the analysis by Igor Stix. There's Igor in the photo. Wait, it's on this side. The video camera films backward. Um, a writer and a sociologist who talks about transition and its relation to violence, and he makes some comparative and historical observations that might be useful to us in talking about new states and violence. First, although transition is often postulated as being a positive goal, as something to which states ought to aspire, or they ought to aspire to finish with it, it brings with it consequences that are desired, like the introduction of formal democracy, and also consequences that are not desired. Those include economic consequences, like the undesirable consequences of privatization, especially rapid privatization, and political consequences, which include violence. So when we talk about the disintegration of federal states, we run into an irony. On the one hand, in many cases, the disintegration of federal states and the establishment of new national and ethnically based states on the ground that these once occupied are in some ways an expression of democracy. But what are they an expression of democracy against? Okay, um, this is a question that we need to approach, particularly in states which did not have a very strong authoritarian center against which to rebel. The second question we want to ask is, when new states were established, was separation accepted? Were the new borders accepted? And were the new states accepted, either mutually or into international communities? And that's what's shown in this table here. This is a table taken from the article by Igor Stix, offering different answers to that questions. You know, did everybody accept independence within the state? Did actors outside of the state accept it? And depending on whether the answer is yes or no, you're able to put those states into different categories. Now, this is interesting analytically in terms of drawing distinctions, but we can go further than this. And we can say this, that the question of whether the creation of new states is going to have the result of predicting political violence is going to be answered in relation to a number of fundamental background questions. First of all, the question of whether there's violence depends on whether citizenship rights are distributed equally in the new states that are formed, and this question itself is a little bit path dependent. That is, it's bound up with the political and social histories of the states and the states that they emerge out of. Second, whenever we see new states formed and new political communities created, particularly if they're created principally on a national basis, we see revealed this fundamental tension between ethnic rights on the one hand and democracy on the other. And the question is raised as to whether equality is a necessary component element of democracy. Third, we're able to witness in the creation of nationally and ethnically based states a process of ethnic engineering, that is, the creation of territories that have majorities, usually from the majority ethnic group. This process of ethnic engineering is not always necessarily a violent process, but in most of the cases that we're able to witness, particularly in the region that we're looking at, it is. A further point we might raise here, in the cases where there was violence, the organizations that created violence were, generally speaking, not new. That is, they depended on the participation of institutions that already existed under the previous order, and in particular the repressive institutions of the state, of the military and the police. And finally, he makes the argument that in most cases, violence that resulted from democratic challenges to the legitimacy of states, that is, that resulted from contestation of legitimacy, did not result in changes in borders. Violence seeking to establish new legitimacy very often did. Now, this is an analysis that does not offer many conclusions, but it's makes the contribution, I think, of suggesting that that there's a set of factors that makes violence more likely in some instances than in others. Maybe the conclusions that are offered to this are implicit, but what I've tried to do in this section with this presentation of 3 images from outside that are superimposed upon the states of ex-Yugoslavia and to a certain degree of region, is to try to offer an idea in which some pre-existing conceptions sometimes contribute to and sometimes detract from understanding. The important thing, I think, for us to do as analysts is to be aware of these.